On June 24th, 2024, the FDA made the decision to reject MDMA-assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. This was following Lykos's phase 3 clinical trials, Lykos being formerly MAPS PBC, and this was largely a surprise in the psychedelic field, especially after the FDA designated MDMA as a breakthrough therapy in 2017, and early research results were showing impressive efficacy as medicine. At the same time, psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, is being widely studied. Right now, COMP360, a psilocybin analog, is currently undergoing its own phase 3 clinical trials, these for treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. And the results of these trials are expected to be shared sometime in the next month. Compass Pathways is the company behind COMP360, and they will no doubt be submitting an application to the FDA as soon as possible in hopes of getting their psilocybin treatment to market. This would mark a major milestone in expanding legal psychedelic therapy in the Western world. But whether the FDA will approve COMP360 after the surprise outcome of the MDMA remains to be seen. One thing is certain. If Compass Pathways wants their determination to pay off, they'll have to learn from MAPS's mistakes. So, will magic mushrooms succeed where MDMA failed? And what comes next? Well, let's break it down. We'll take a look at exactly where the controversial MDMA application went wrong in a moment, but a good place to start is to answer the question, what does FDA approval mean, and what is the process to get it? And here's the thing. FDA approval is an absolute must-have for any drug to be legally sold in the USA. And decisions that the FDA makes are influential globally as well. Think of it like a sort of gold standard that can influence other regulators and governments around the world who want safe and effective medications for their own jurisdictions. When it comes to psychedelic treatments, the majority of research being done is focused on psychiatric conditions. So think depression, anxiety, PTSD. And there have been incredibly few breakthrough psychiatric medications and treatments in recent times. There is a lot of optimism about the early findings of psychedelic research, since these conditions affect people all around the world and can be notoriously hard to treat. So FDA approval for new medications signals that the drug has been thoroughly researched, evaluated, and found to have benefits that outweigh the risks for the people it's intended for. In order for any drug manufacturer to get FDA approval for a new medication or treatment, they need three things. The first is a thorough analysis of the target condition, so PTSD for MAPS's MDMA study and treatment-resistant depression for the COMP360 study. So this would obviously include an understanding of the condition as well as other treatments that are currently available. This way they can compare whether the treatment is more or less effective, what other options or considerations there may be. Second, they would need to clearly demonstrate the benefit to risk ratio, or the efficacy, through clinical research data. So generally, this means at least 2 well-designed clinical trials with substantial data that is not missing key elements or biased in any way. In most cases, companies who are submitting will have done preclinical trials as well as 3 clinical trials. And these start with small groups so that they can focus on safety, dosage, and side effects, and then expand into larger groups to confirm effectiveness, optimize the dosage, and generally gather more information so as to see how it stands up to other treatments that are already available. Oftentimes, companies will seek approval before doing long-term studies, but phase 4 clinical trials that gather the longer-term info are also very common for companies testing new drugs and treatments. So the third thing needed for FDA approval is for the applicant to provide strategies for managing the risks associated with the drug. Foreshadowing here, this is a key piece of the MDMA failure puzzle. A lot of the time, this requirement just means proper FDA labels and side effect warnings. But for drugs with greater risk profiles, the applicant may also need to provide a REMS, or a risk management and mitigation strategy. So to get a new drug to market, all you need is to analyze the target condition, demonstrate that your drug treatment is more effective than it is harmful, and meets a need that current treatments don't. As well, you'll need to provide a means of lessening or decreasing the risks of side effects of the drug. Seems pretty simple, right? But here's the thing. Even though FDA gave MDMA a breakthrough therapy designation for the treatment of PTSD, and gave psilocybin the breakthrough therapy label for both treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder, There are currently no classical psychedelic based therapy treatments approved by the FDA so far. We have esketamine, but that's something of a different beast for another discussion. So, what gives? Designations like breakthrough therapy are a big deal coming from the FDA, but they don't ensure either approval or an expedited process. It just means that the FDA recognizes that the early research results indicate a drug may demonstrate substantial improvement over other available therapies. It's like an encouragement to the applicant to push through with their research, and it can also prompt further investment into the companies doing the research, which helps them essentially acquire essential funding. The FDA does fast track some drugs through their accelerated approval process, but this has only really been seen with things like antiretroviral drugs for HIV and some cancer drugs, where there's often this urgent demand that can allow for more potential risks as long as there's some clear benefit. So while the FDA giving these psychedelic treatments breakthrough designation might help the companies speed up their own research processes, it doesn't mean that the FDA is ready to accept anything less than quality science. It's kind of funny, the rejection of MDMA did come as a big surprise to the industry. For those of you who aren't tuned in too deeply to these things, there was even some kind of conspiracy theories that popped up right after the rejection, indicating that there was a sort of ideological uprising against psychedelics within the FDA. And fair enough, I certainly don't know the inner workings of government dealings, and there has historically been a lot of ideological war against psychedelics in the Western world since the 60s and 70s. But here's the thing, and I know I'll get some flack for this, but I think it was a good thing that MDMA was rejected. First off, the FDA gave clear reasoning for their rejection, and we'll break that down in just a second, but I just want to more clarify my point to illustrate why I think that anyone who is a believer in psychedelics and wants to see these therapies made available should perhaps agree. If you are a believer in the healing power of psychedelics, and I know there are many evangelists out there, and you are a firm believer in the idea that psychedelics will be game changing psychiatric treatments, then you really don't want the first psychedelic therapy approvals to be built on anything less than the best science. If psychedelics actually are to make a comeback and become in any way integrated into our modern society, and especially if they are to effectively transform mental health treatment, then it benefits the entire industry to have clear, unbiased, and untainted research. This isn't some vaccines cause autism type research that has larger holes in it than the ozone in the 90s. It can't be, or the future potential of these substances as medicine will be as controversial and superstition ridden as their past. If these substances truly are life changing, then good science will show it. So that begs the question, what was wrong with the research of MDMA that MAP submitted? And was the rejection warranted? There were a couple of key issues flagged by the FDA with the MAP submission. Firstly, the panel voted 10 to 1 that benefits do not outweigh the risks. This was supported by a report from the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, an independent watchdog. So the risks highlighted included cardiovascular risks, worsening mental health symptoms, including suicidal thoughts, and the risk of substance dependency. Substance dependency is an issue highlighted by the rocky start we've seen with esketamine as a medication. Secondly, there was the glaring issue of sexual misconduct during trials. Therapists in MAPS's phase 2 trials were accused of sexual abuse and inappropriate behavior, which prompted the journal Psychopharmacology to later retract several papers, citing these ethical violations and a failure to disclose conflicts of interests between the authors and MAPS. Thirdly was the problem of something called functional unblinding. For context, double-blind placebo-based studies are the gold standard, which simply means that there will be participants in the studies who receive the drug being tested and others who receive a placebo. Blind means that the participants won't know ahead of time whether they're receiving the placebo or the real thing. This way, their experience isn't altered by their expectations. And MDMA's profound mind-altering effects make it nearly impossible to effectively blind patients, as this cartoon illustrates. it quickly becomes clear who took the real thing versus the placebo. The challenge here is that unblinding could affect trial results because participants might experience different outcomes based on their expectations. So, overarching all of this was a clear message that getting approval for drug assisted psychotherapy is going to be much more complicated than getting approval for just a drug as a medication. The FDA doesn't regulate psychotherapy, and the combined approach complicates the data around drug specific details. So, this likely played a role in the concerns raised about long term safety and efficacy. So, what does this mean for MDMA therapy and Lykos? It's safe to say that MDMA will be approved eventually. Whether or not Lykos is the one to do it is a different story. This is complicated by them just recently having all of their patent applications rejected. But if it is to be Lykos, the FDA has requested a resubmission. So this will mean having to provide more robust data through a newly designed phase 3 clinical trial, possibly focusing on just the drug rather than drug plus psychotherapy, as well as a more extensive risk mitigation strategy. So although this is just another bump in a long road for psychedelic therapy, this could be a good thing for the field of psychedelic medicine as a whole, as researchers work towards finding safer and more effective strategies. Dr. Rachel Yehuda, director of the Center for Psychedelic Psychotherapy and Trauma Research at Mount Sinai's Icahn School of Medicine, was quoted by CNN as commenting on the FDA rejection. The whole field of science is one of peer review and critique. People are always weighing in, and hopefully that makes a better product. There's a difference between saying, we think this drug is dangerous, and asking for more data. To answer the question of whether psilocybin or magic mushrooms will succeed where MDMA failed, well, only time will tell, but based on everything that we've looked at, I personally think there's a good chance for a couple of reasons. For one, the COMP 360 study is focused on the substance itself, not in conjunction with psychotherapy or anything else. Avoiding sexual misconduct and other ethical violations should be a pretty obvious and easy step, and even functional unblinding has possible workarounds. Although it does pose quite an obstacle for psychedelic trials, the FDA has recommended using an active placebo, which would mean having a placebo that perhaps mimics some of the effects of the test substance, but without the same therapeutic benefits. Another reason is regarding the long-term risks. So, two of the major risks flagged with MDMA, cardiovascular issues and substance dependency, are not common issues found with magic mushrooms. Psilocybin has long been noted for its anti-addictive properties, so it seems likely that Compass Pathways will be able to provide a risk mitigation strategy that can meet the demands of the FDA. So last but not least, the phase 3 data for COMP 360 is going to have to showcase a strong benefit relative to the risks. And this should be interesting to watch, as currently the phase 2 data does show some adverse mental health reactions in all dosage categories. So although psilocybin in the form of COMP 360 has a lot going for it here, it isn't a shoo-in. If you find yourself wondering what all of this will mean for legal psychedelic and psychedelic therapies more broadly, be sure to subscribe to stay updated on this story and others. And in the meantime, you might find this video interesting.